Welcome to a special edition of Popper's Perspective, the Giants Huddle podcast, presented by Bob's Discount Furniture. Get Bob's Discount at the official furniture store and mattress partner of the New York Giants. Shop in store at mybobs.com. So, you have the Giants playing host to Washington. Legacy game as well. They're going to bust out the uniforms from the 1980s. And who better to talk about it than our good buddy Sean Landeta, who had one of the great games in Giants history in the NFC Championship game when you guys hosted Washington. Sean, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Bob. Great to be here with you.
So let's go to that game. January the 11th, 1987. You had already beaten Washington twice that year. The weather conditions were brutal. It was cold. It was windy in that old Giants stadium. And, Bill Parcells throws around compliments like manhole covers. And he has said that Sean Landeta was the MVP of that game. I mean, the way you were able to punt in that stadium that day, what was it like for you going into the game?
Well, it was very difficult. We knew the wind was going to be terrible, and Bill was always very cognizant of that kind of stuff. With the punt returners, making sure you caught the ball and, to try to punt the ball the best you can. And fortunately for me, I was just, able to hit some real good punts that day that helped us out.
All right, so now you're underselling it a little bit. You hit some good punts. Let's talk about, first of all, the art of being able to do that, because what is the mindset of a punter when you're dealing with conditions where the winds are gusting at 30 miles per hour?
Well, the most important thing, I think, is to try to not get more than you can. You understand what you're dealing with. I was very lucky that every day I got to practice in those terrible conditions. So it really helped me. So many other punters that would come into Giant Stadium would say to me after the game, God, how do you play in here? And it's because I got to practice there every day. So try not to get too much. Don't try to hit a 40 or 50-yard punt. If 35 is the best you can get, take it. And, I always tried to keep that mindset.
You averaged 42 yards a punt that day, and really kind of the game plan, because you guys were built around the running game and the defense. So when you always hear coaches talk about complementary football, but that day it was complementary football at its finest, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, Washington was a terrific team. They won the Super Bowl the next year, and if we're not there, they may win it that year. I mean, they were really good, but that day, the defense was amazing. The offense did what they had to do. And on special teams, we were able to contribute.
How much was it vindication for you as well, after what had happened the year before in Chicago, to be able to come back and have a dominant performance in helping the team win and get to the first ever Super Bowl in Giants history?
No, it was. I had a bad moment the year before and, still have to hear about that 35 years later. Unfortunately, I hear about that much more than the Washington game, but it certainly was good to have a good game that following year, especially in such an important game in the NFC Championship game.
So let's, in the NFC Championship game in Giant Stadium, how important was it, the fact that you guys got out to the lead too? Raul hits a field goal in the first quarter. Then Sims throws a touchdown pass to Lionel Manuel. So it's already 10-zip in the first quarter. Did that make your job, I'm not going to say easier, but did it make everything a little bit more manageable for you at that point, knowing the kind of defense that you guys have?
Not really, because my thought was if I didn't hit a good punt, they could get a touchdown and they'd be right back in the game. So no question having a lead helped, but it was a situation where every single one was so important because it was such a tight game. The defense was, totally shutting them down, but we on special teams didn't want to give them a touchdown with a poor play.
We're talking about you punting the ball. When winds are gusting in that old Giant stadium and paper's swirling and things are blowing in every which way, talk about the role of the long snapper, because it's not like he's handing you the ball. You got to handle the snaps. Did you have any where they did the deep dive on you or anything like that with a gust of wind?
Well, it's interesting. When the wind's like that, if I'm punting into the wind, the snapper's actually snapping with the wind. So that's something that helped me because the balls came back like bullets. vice versa, when I have the wind at my back, the snap will unravel a little bit because he has to snap it into that terrible wind. So that kind of helped me a little bit. That the situation that was not good for me was good for my center, but that gave me an extra tenth or two to set it up.
As the clock is winding down at 17-0, the Giants are doing something that anybody who grew up in this area thought would never happen. The Giants actually going to the Super Bowl, let alone you guys going on to win it. Was that one of the best feelings that you've ever had personally, as well as collectively with the team, knowing the role that you played in that game?
You know, it was, Bob. I can remember usually after every game is over, you say hello to someone on the other side and you go inside. But this one, I told myself just to sit down on the bench there, listen to the crowd, watch all the confetti swirl around, and really take it in, because that's something most of us don't do. But yeah, I said, take this in, because this is such a special moment. You never know if it'll happen again.
Obviously, you got a chance to do it again a couple of years later and winning Super Bowl 25. Sean, I want to go back to this rivalry with Washington, because when you beat them 17-0 in the NFC Championship game, you completed a season sweep of Washington. You beat them 3 times, which is virtually impossible. I want to go back to earlier in the season at Giants Stadium, because you guys are coming off the loss to Seattle in Seattle. You're 5-2. Washington 6-1 coming into Giants Stadium. You two guys are you're the heavyweights in the division at this point in the NFC East. And it was a pretty memorable Monday night at Giants Stadium, wasn't it?
It really was. The crowd was electric. And one thing I remember is back then they used to have these little Watchman televisions. And it seemed like every person in the stands had one, because the Mets were playing Game 7 that night over at Shea Stadium. And all those antennas were glistening in the light at night. And it was really some scene. And ironically, the Redskins hit a big pass to Gary Clark down by our goal line at the same time the Mets scored a run. So our whole fans, all of our fans cheered like heck. And for a moment, we said, what's going on here? But that was really a great night for us to be able to beat them the same night that the Mets won the World Series.
And you guys had a 20-10 lead in this game, and they come back in the football game. And, you guys wind up winning it late. Joe Morris with a 13-yard touchdown run, and Joe finishes with 181 yards. And this was another one of those games, Sean, where complimentary football comes into play. I think you averaged 43 yards a punt in this game, and kind of helped the defense control what at the time was a pretty explosive offense in Washington. But just sort of your recollections of sort of the back and forth, the thinking you had the game, they come back, and then your team's ability to always rally when you needed to.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the mark of our team that year, Bob. I mean, it was amazing how well we played. There were, as dominant as we were, there were a few games that year where, if you look statistically, we were outplayed, and you can make a case that 2 or 3 of those games could have went the other way. But both sides of the ball and special teams, we all seemed to do what was necessary, to get a win. And, that's part of why that made that such a memorable season.
The week before that game, you guys lost in Seattle. You would go on to win your last 9 regular season games, including completing the sweep of Washington in the NFC Championship game. In total, you wound up winning your final 12 games. When you beat Washington that night to tie them for the division lead, and then you had the tiebreaker because you had beaten them at least head-to-head that night, did you guys feel like you were kind of ready to get on a little bit of a roll, or did that come a little bit later in the season?
That probably came a little bit later, Bob. I mean, certainly that was a huge win for us because they were such a good team. And, with all those games left, there was a lot that could happen. But as you said, we just managed to keep winning and, separate ourselves down at the end of the season. And sure enough, we had to face them again. It's like they wouldn't go away. But what a great year that was for us.
A lot of your former teammates, always talk about the rivalry with Washington in that point in time was very intense, because you're both Super Bowl caliber teams. But there was also a little bit of a respectful factor to it. Did it feel that way between you and Washington, that it was heated, it was intense, but there was some level of sort of respect that you guys had for each other?
Yeah, I think you could say that, just because we knew how good they were. They knew how good we were. And, they were almost like playoff games during the season, because they were so well coached. had so many good players that it was never going to be easy. And because of that, even though you try your best every week, maybe you just put a little bit more into it because you knew what kind of team you were playing.
And I know Parcells has always talked about the fact that there was nothing better than a road win in Washington, to hear the silence, because that stadium would shake. For those that weren't in the old RFK, it was old. The stands moved. It was pretty raucous, but you guys walked out of there with a lot of silence over the years.
We did. It was kind of interesting. It seemed for a while there that we had a pretty good record beating Washington. Washington was able to beat Philly quite often, and for a few years there, we had a hard time beating Philly. It was an interesting circle, but we were very happy that we were able to win those games against those great Redskins teams.
So this weekend, the Giants are going to be wearing the uniforms of the 80s and into the 90s. You wore that uniform proudly and winning 2 Super Bowls with the Giants. Is it cool for you to see them dust that thing off and roll out there wearing them?
It really is. We haven't seen that in so long, and to see that old helmet with the Giants logo on the side spelled out, and our old uniforms, it really does bring back a lot of good memories. And you see the different numbers on the field. You think about some of your different teammates, and I'm looking forward to that. Certainly hope they can get a win.
Sean, we appreciate a couple minutes. Thank you for taking us down memory lane against Washington, especially 1986 and those 2 defining home wins, both in the regular season and obviously the NFC Championship game in Giants Stadium, where you had one of the most dominant performances in that game to help the Giants win at 17-0. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Appreciate it, Bob. Thanks for having me.
That's Sean Landeta joining us for this special Papa's Perspective edition of the Giants Huddle podcast, presented by Bob's Discount Furniture. Bob's is back with major style and savings on furniture, mattresses, decor, and much more for your home. Shop in store or online at mybobs.com. Bob's Discount Furniture, the official furniture store and mattress partner of the New York Giants.